Hello, this is Wade Frazier. This is February 19th, 2026, 10:25 a.m. So my previous post on this oral history ended with my exit from my hometown of Ventura, California in 1990. Have not been back, don't plan to go back. And I was a newlywed moving to Ohio and put my wife through her doctoral program. And anyway, spent the next 6 years in Ohio. They were great years for us. It was a good time. If Ohio had mountains, could have stayed. So anyway, I want to get into essentially my days of study, which began. So as I mentioned previously, my days of study really began when Dennis was in jail, as I was performing the research that I thought could help brief any extra witnesses that I might line up for Dennis's trial. Uh, and but once Dennis got out, miraculously, soon thereafter, I didn't study a whole lot the next that after that really. I was too busy digging out of my financial abyss and working in LA, courting my wife, avoiding Dennis and Mr. Researcher, and trying to recover from all that. Um, and my stage of study really didn't begin in earnest until I moved away to Ohio in September of 1990. And those days of study have not ended. So I've been pretty much a bookworm. I was a bookworm from the time I could walk, but I really became a bookworm after September 1990. And I've said this previously, I say it quite a bit, is that if I hadn't have, without my ride with Dennis, I probably wouldn't have much worse thing, because I wouldn't have really woken up yet. I would have been naive. My perspective would have been quite stunted. And so I had to go through an awakening process before my studies would be useful. And I mentioned my awakening process began when I was 12. My family changed its diet. I had a bunch of, for the next 18 years, a series of events that gradually woke me up. The first thing, when we moved to Ohio, this is we're settling in to our home. I subscribed to this magazine that I heard of when I was driving to work in Los Angeles. It was an interview with the publisher of a new magazine called Lives of Our Times. So when I moved to Ohio, I subscribed to it because I was so ready for the message of how the media doesn't tell the truth. And when I subscribed to it, I found out that Noam Chomsky contributed a column every month. And he was the only name that I knew. So that was the beginning of my study of Noam Chomsky's work. And Ed Herman turns out to be, he was the editor of Lives of Our Times. And I didn't know that. I had no idea of his relationship with Noam. Um, I remember I started buying Noam's books soon after I started doing these studies, among many, as I'll get into all the many subjects I studied in those days. And I just gradually became aware of it. And the first issue of the first page of the first issue of Lives of Our Times, which was late the autumn of 1990, I subscribed for the next 4 years until it went out of business in late 1994. But my first issue's first page is the one I still remember best, and it was a short article on how the New York Times translated Arabic script to make all Arabs seem like religious fanatics. And in fact, the article referred to a previous instance several months earlier where the New York Times had also done that. So this is a standard practice of the New York Times. And in that instance, it was an article in the New York Times which actually had a picture of the logo of the Bank of Kuwait, and the logo had a camel in the center of it, and then along the edge was Arabic script. And if you could read Arabic script, it said Bank of Kuwait, Kuwait, established in 1952 or something. But the New York Times told its readers that the Arabic script said there is no deity but Allah. Yeah, it was make it up as you go translations. And so and again, I'd already watched the New York Times or the Los Angeles Times make it up as it went along, and to see the New York Times make it up as it went along that was a very significant moment for me to see that the National Enquirer had more journalistic integrity than the New York Times did. And in fact, in both those instances, New York Times was contacted with its mistranslation of the script. And the New York Times just shrugged it off. No correction, no nothing. Just keep doing it. Yeah, so just give the finger to anybody who figures it out. So anyway, that was a significant moment for me in my first issue. And so then I was every month I was reading my Lives of Our Times, and that was one of many things, publications that I've subscribed to or bought or checked out, etc. In that next year. In fact, there's a book titled Unreliable Sources, and it wasn't. It was actually a little how to say it, a little more easier to read than Manufacturing Consent, and I read Unreliable Sources before I read Manufacturing Consent. And Unreliable Sources, I remember, was definitely that was a moment for me. It was like it was a book that described in quite a bit of detail of how the media lies and why it lies. In fact, I think they cited Manufacturing Consent in that book also. In fact, I bought a few copies and handed them out to people I knew. And around the same time, I subscribed to a magazine called Covert Action Information Bulletin. I think today it's just called Covert Action. It's still around. And that magazine dealt with the CIA and friends. And at that time, I had not heard about the CIA's $1 billion offer to my partner Dennis back in '88. I knew about my relative who was a contract agent for the CIA who worked for Henry Kissinger, and I had heard about Gary Wien's reporting on the CIA's role in the JFK assassination and some other spook stuff. But studying the CIA and spooks, that was new to me. That was new to me to reading about CIA and spooks. And then I also subscribed to the Christic Institute's Journal of Emergence, and that was founded by Danny Sheehan, and he's getting a lot of visibility these days with his efforts. And so I subscribed to that. It was like a newsletter, not quite as substantial as Lives of Our Times. And and Christic Institute got put out of business by the CIA essentially, and they got and they waged a big lawsuit and wrapped the CIA, and it was wide ranging, had the JFK assassination, all these kinds of things in there, and the CIA asset judge fined them basically out of existence. And again, she is still going, but that original organization went defunct because of the $1 million that was levied against it. And when I was reading Covert Action, in first issue or something, I was getting my hands on everything I could, and ordered a book through Covert Action, which was a book titled Deadly Deceits. And it was a book that was written by a CIA case officer named Ralph McGehee. And anyway, so I got that book, and then my reading style was reading many things at once. So I next to my bed, I'd have this constant growing pile of books. And when the pile would get too big and dangerous, I would put everything away and start over. So I was just constantly reading all sorts of stuff. I was devouring as much as I could. Those were interesting days for me to be exposed to all this other information. I really started studying deeply. And reading Deadly Deceits turned out to be one of my biggest aha moments in my lifetime, really. And the book, after a moving introduction, the next several chapters were a pretty dry read of Ralph McGehee's journey in his career at the CIA. And he was in East Asia originally, Japan, the Philippines, and China. And then he'd come back between stints at work at the headquarters in Langley there in Washington, D.C. And I remember about, a few chapters in, several chapters into it, I just put it aside and it was dry, and I put it aside and was reading all this other stuff. And I remember over the next month or so, I'd keep looking and thinking about that book that I had put aside. And once I start a book, I do my best to finish it. And after about a month of it just sitting there, I said, okay, let me buckle down and read this. And glad I did. And so Ralph, in fact, I think I stopped just before his adventures in Thailand. And when Ralph was in Thailand, and this is, in the mid 60s, Ralph developed a program that exposed and reversed communist infiltration in rural Thailand. And he created, and this program actually won awards. It was an award-winning program. It was the peak of Ralph's career. And at that time, he had been in the CIA about 15 years. And he was a dedicated Cold Warrior, dedicated to defeating those communists. And anyway, so Ralph was, again, it was a big breakthrough. They actually found a way to defeat the communists there in Thailand. And Ralph did something that was kind of Machiavellian, but not nearly as other counterinsurgency efforts would boil communists in oil and stuff. And Ralph was a little gentler with Ralph. Yeah, I mean, actually, there were people who died from Ralph's efforts, which I know he regretted. But generally, though, it was just a pretty gentler method, let's say, of exposing the communists. And so, anyway, he found out a lot. And then William Colby, eventually head of the CIA. And that time he was the head of the Far East desk here at the CIA. And so he came by Ralph's operation and to get debriefed. And so anyway, Ralph debriefed William Colby, and Ralph said one of the key findings, though, of their intelligence effort was that the CIA had been, publicly their stance was these communists were these evil people who terrorized the peasants and stuff. And that's the only way, and their reign of terror is the only way they had any traction there in Southeast Asia. And Ralph's investigation showed that wasn't true. You found that the communists actually, they were beloved. In fact, they spent almost all their time winning the cooperation of the peasants, helping them get in their harvest and this kind of stuff. So the communists were like their buddies. And so this is the opposite of what the CIA was publicly asserting, or what it was even in the halls of the CIA. Anyway, as Ralph told Colby this contrary information, Colby didn't take it well. In fact, at one point, Colby said, "We always seem to be losing." And anyway, soon after Colby left, they canceled Ralph's program, this very successful program. And Ralph soon found himself behind a meeting desk at Langley, bewildered. He had no idea what had happened. Why they shut down this successful program? And so, well, as I get into later, it was the wrong answer. So, yeah, communism could be damned as an evil if the peasants actually wanted it. So this was, Ralph came up with the wrong answer. But Ralph was still such a dedicated Cold War that he volunteered for Vietnam in 1968. And volunteering for Vietnam in 68 was only what crazy Americans did. Yeah, it was. Yeah, nobody's saying, no sane American wanted to be in Vietnam in 1968. That was, wasn't the place to be. But Ralph did, and he signed up, and he was there, and he was in Saigon and he was there for about 3 years. Yeah, anyway, but after the end of about a year, one night, Ralph finally figured it out. In fact, he began his book with this scene where he's just sobbing with a big bottle of whiskey on one side, his service revolver on the other side, and looking at pictures of napalmed children, Vietnamese children who had been napalmed by the United States. And Ralph never forgot what it was like to smell flesh that had been burned by napalm. And so this was something that, he had his moment of truth. 16 years into his career, when he finally realized that he wasn't one of the good guys, that the CIA was just, the secret police essentially of another empire. that slaughtered millions of people to, enforce its oppression. Um, yeah, so this is something that was the turning point of Ralph's life. In fact, I call it his awakening moment. And kind of like when Dennis Lee first woke up in a bank lobby to how the American ideal is bogus. Yeah, the American dream really is not real. Um, American nationalism is kind of phony. Um, Ralph realized that, he was not one of the good guys, and that they were slaughtering millions of people to basically recolonize the region so we could get a hold of their oil, rubber, and tin, as the Pentagon Papers later admitted. Um, yeah, so that night, and Ralph had thought of theatrical ways of killing himself to to advertise the CIA's misdeeds. And he realized that the CIA would just take vengeance on his family. So that night, he decided not to kill himself, but he would devote the rest of his life to exposing what the CIA was and did. And in 1970, when he finally went home, he was a ruined man. And he quietly got educated in the stacks of the CIA. And in the 1970s, the CIA got dragged through the mud. The church, Watergate happened, and the church committee meetings happened, and they started offering early retirement back in the late 70s. And Ralph eagerly took that. In fact, got a career achievement medal there at the CIA, uh, which they didn't even get the facts right on their medal. And he said it was Ralph said it was kind of typical of the CIA. Yeah, so he retired in good standing, and then he spent a couple of years writing his book. In fact, I need to cut this kind of short in this part because I'm going to devote a whole post to Ralph here soon. Anyway, so he eventually wrote his book that exposed the CIA, but had to engage in a 2-year epic legal battle with the CIA to finally publish his book in 1983. And Ralph's one of only 4 CIA employees who wrote critical memoirs in the 20th century. And he was only one of 2 who actually abided by the secrecy agreement and went through the legal channels of publishing his book. And the final book's riddled with censorship deletions. And so anyway, so finished. So Ralph's book ended up. I remember when I hit that, what he found out in Thailand and Vietnam, etc. That was a big moment in my understanding of like, wow, okay, it was important for me to finish the book and seeing the arc of Ralph's journey of being just this, all-American boy. Literally, he was an all-American football player. He's in the college football Hall of Fame, and to really, try to be. He was a Boy Scout. Ralph was a Boy Scout, trying to do the right thing, and eventually realized he wasn't one of the good guys. And so that was a powerful arc of awakening. And the conclusion is, yeah, the U.S. is just another empire. I'll write and talk about that more later. And the media and the spooks were just some of the many subjects that I studied in those days. And so I had obtained, in fact, back in my Ventura days, I got Mr. Mentor's and Victor Fisher's engine patents. And in fact, and then when I moved to Ohio, and my wife went to Wright State, and so I was able to. So I would visit the library there and check books out. And I remember checking a couple books out on thermodynamics. And so, back in the Ventura days, et cetera, I was the accounting guy running the business, et cetera. So I really I wasn't involved really in the technical side of that, but I wanted to know it. In fact, I was trying to get hip on that so I could, brief extra witnesses. So anyway, so I decided let me get to the bottom of this. And so I remember checking out a couple of thermodynamics textbooks, and one was a standard textbooks for scientists and engineers, and the other was thermodynamics for poets. In fact, there's classes they call physics for poets, and basically what it is that it's popularized science. So it's popularized science, so you don't have to be a scientist to take these classes. Again, it is to get the gist of these disciplines across to people that's not their specialty, and that's why they call it physics for poets. In fact, my pal Brian O'Leary taught physics for poets at Princeton, etc. And so anyway, the one for scientists, I had I was a math whiz, ace calculus in college, but there I was in the thermodynamics text for engineers, and page 2 was calculus, and I hadn't cranked out a calculus derivative for 12 years or 15 years maybe at that time, and so yeah, I, I didn't want to go through the process of getting back. I mean, literally studying calculus again, et cetera, to just understand the gist of thermodynamics. And so I read the Thermodynamics for Poets book, which was good. It was great. And at the end of that book, I understood the basics of thermodynamics. And also that began a trend, which I do to this day, which is the people I seek, they don't need to be professional scientists or know calculus to develop a comprehensive perspective. Math's good, so math's a useful tool, but it's how to say it. In fact, I crunched numbers my whole career as an accountant, and it's the thing where once you spend a career crunching numbers, et cetera, you understand very well their limitations and often tenuous relationship to reality. Science has the same problem. And so it's a thing where science is a little too math dependent. And this has been, and again, in the years since then, I've seen very good critiques on that. How, science is a little too math dependent. In fact, it goes back to Galileo and Newton to avoid church censorship, et cetera. So it's, so science is a little too math dependent. In fact, it tends to make it too arcane. So anyway, so popularized science is great stuff. In fact, Albert Einstein he loved reading popularized science when he was a kid. So popularized science is good stuff. And in fact, I've some of the scientists that I follow, they read popularized science and they're reading outside their discipline, so they can, get the lay of the land, in other areas. So yeah, this has a good popularized science has plays an important role in our world, and I use it a lot. I've read hundreds of books on popularized science since then. But Thermodynamics for Poets is one of the earliest books I read on popularized science. And again, after getting done reading it, I understood why Mr. Menner's engine and Victor Fission's engines were so amazing and unusual, and probably beat everything else. And I understood why Dennis's heat pump was the world's best heating system. Yeah, so these are the things that I learned. So again, studying the patents while I'm also studying the science. It took me about a month probably of my so-called spare time to do that there in the fall of 1990. Yeah, so it was good stuff. And I also, again, I'm a mystical awakener when I was 16. I became quite the student of spirituality. And then, I mentioned in my previous posts how I've been to, over 50 channel sessions, probably 100 between channel and psychic readings, almost 100 of them. I haven't done that in many years, but that was good. Those are good years doing all that. But I really began building my mystical library. In fact, we joined a spiritual community in Dayton. In fact, an amazingly accomplished one, much more so than what I saw in California, in LA, believe it or not. And I also joined a fringe science organization called the U.S. Psychotronics Association that also met there locally in Dayton. In fact, it was really paradoxical, let's say. So my wife went to Wright State, which was actually right next to Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, which is the biggest Air Force base in the world. In fact, that's where the Wright brothers first flew their planes after they came back from Kitty Hawk. There's a field called Wright Field, I believe, where it was a pasture where they flew their planes for 5 years, being ignored and ridiculed by mainstream science and the media. And that's where the reputed home of Blue Room, Hangar 18, et cetera, are aliens on ice, this kind of thing, which I will get to later. But I joined the Psychotronics organization, and I started really getting involved in the free energy field and the fringe science fields, which I said when I became Dennis's partner, we didn't even know there was a free energy field. So then I started meeting people who had devoted their lives to free energy technology and a lot of fringe topics. There's chaff there, but there's real stuff there too. And these were things I learned over the years. And so, in fact, the summer of 1991, I was unemployed, and the Psychotronics Organization's national conference was there near Dayton. In fact, there's this kind of hippie community right next to Wright-Patterson. Again, it's a very strange, paradoxical kind of situation where Yellow Springs was again within a few miles of the world's biggest Air Force base, and Yellow Springs was full of these tie-dyed hippie types, which my wife and I hung out there a lot, and that's what actually we had the national conference. And I was assigned to 50 people from the airport, and I picked up this speaker from the airport, a guy named Brian O'Leary. And I'll get into that later. So I'll have a video devoted to Brian here soon also. As Ed Herman, Ralph, Brian, those ones I'm going to be doing those real soon. So I was really starting to get into studying a lot of different bodies of mystical material, channel works, raw material, micromaterial. I'd already studied Seth a lot back in my younger days, and now I started exploring this whole world, this kind of material. Again, after it had many paranormal experiences, amazing channel sessions, etc. So then I really started coming at it from the book side of it. It was good stuff, great stuff. And I also began exploring alternative medicine. And again, particularly what happened in my medical lab employer there in Los Angeles back in 88 to 89. When the owner finally sold out, I got to see the medical racket in action. So, and again, when I was age 12, I really was kind of introduced to the medical racket in a way, because it was a treatment that reversed hardening of the arteries, but there was no mention of it in Orthodox medicine. And I soon found out why. But I remember it was a Canadian company. I can't remember the name of it now, but I started mail ordering their books also. Yeah, back then, before the internet, so you get a hold of catalogs and you start ordering books and subscribing to magazines. That's how it was done back then. And anyway, I got a book by Christopher Bird, a very famous author. His book on Gaston de Sands. And which from there I daisy chained to some books on Royal Rife. And both of those guys had microscopes that got so-called impossible resolutions, which actually led to amazing discoveries at the microbiological level. In fact, the general term is pleomorphic. So it's a thing where things change a lot there at the subcellular level. And there's subcellular dynamics that are taking place today that are largely unrecognized by Orthodox science. And the Sands and Rife, with their microscopes, they document all that stuff. And Rife operated, a century ago. And the Sands, he started doing his work right after World War II. So these are back, this has been around a long time. In fact, it goes back to Louis Pasteur's rival, and who Pasteur plagiarized several times, a guy named Antoine Béchamp. Back there in the mid 1800s. And so there's another whole branch of biomedicine that's been largely ignored and suppressed by orthodoxy, because it comes up with different answers for how to be well and how to treat disease, especially degenerative disease. And then from the Rife books I read, I daisy chained, again, from the reference. I always read the references in these books I'd be reading. And I got a hold of Ralph Hovnanian's Medical Dark Ages. And I became Ralph's friend eventually. Soon I came around, saw him actually within a year, visited him. He was in Chicago. And the Medical Dark Ages was really my big wake-up call on the medical rack. In fact, the first book that I wrote about my experiences, I think more than half of it was I spent transcribing all the quotes from Medical Dark Ages, which actually have one of my essays on my website are those quotes. And I remember that was quite an experience to go through Ralph's quotation collage. Yeah, kaleidoscopic experience on the corruption in the medical establishment. And I studied all those at once. And in late 1990 and early 1991, just as the United States began a generation of bloodshed in the Middle East, beginning with Iraq, first Gulf War, which led to my first public writings. So I wrote letters to the editors. In fact, they always got published. So whenever I wrote a letter, whether it was in Ohio or Washington State here, they would publish my letters to the editor. So it was the beginning of my writing career, let's say. And my professional career, though, the story of my career was looking for work in a recession. I got out of work. I got out of school in '81 during the worst recession of World War II. And when we moved to Ohio in 1990, it was also right in the teeth of another recession. You know, the hangover from the Reagan greed years and the savings and loan collapse, et cetera. I got a temporary job. When I got there, I only could work as a temp. Like an hour away, I had a long drive, an hour long commute to work in the back office of a savings and loan bank. And I got to witness actually some of the carnage of the scandal that I saw before it became a scandal, several years earlier. And that job ended in the summer of '91. And I was there for like 8 months or something. And that job ended though by the summer of '91. I was reconstructing a lot. I clean up messes. So much of my career was cleaning up big messes. So I got that mess cleaned up, and that was the end of my assignment there. And then I was unemployed. In fact, we'd run out of money by then from my wife's sale of her home, et cetera. And we were on the brink of desperation when I finally landed a job as a controller of a trucking company. And I was there for the next 5 years. But my wife in her studies, she studied psychology, and I was reeling from the events in Ventura. And my wife began insisting that I get therapy. I mean, she believed in it. So, and I did, and it helped. And I actually went to a therapist there in Dayton. Who that was interesting. In fact, my first book was like my first Dear Diary was completed as a part of therapy. And my therapist he was blown away by my journey. And in fact, he sort of let down his therapist mask some days and confided to me some of the stuff that he was dealing with and related to what I was going through. And again, as fact, I write about it. I linked to a little bit in this post where as 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 I'm sitting on his couch out the windows, all you can see all these American flags because the street he was on was where they had their victory parade, for the Gulf War One, how we slaughtered all these helpless people. And it was just big, rah, sis, boom, bah. And my therapist, he was a child of the '60s, protesting Vietnam and stuff. And he was thoroughly disgusted about what was going on. In fact, he confided to me that one of his clients was a Navy SEAL. It was actually one of the first. He came up, there through the Gulf, swimming in, and he came in the short-lived ground war in Iraq. He was there. He was there before. I mean, he was one of the early participants in that, and he saw slaughtered women and children and this kind of thing. And he came back thoroughly messed up. And again, back kind of like Ralph, questioning is he really one of the good guys when he saw the United States slaughter so many women and children, which is all covered up, of course, in the media. You never saw those reports in the media. And then about the same time I was seeing this therapist, I finally was lining up getting this job. And then I also worked at the national conference of the U.S. Psychotronics Association. And that's where I was assigned to bring people to and back and forth from the airport. And that's when I picked up this guy named Brian O'Leary. That's how I met Brian. And I'll get into that in my post with Brian soon. And I've read about this a lot. And that when I worked the conference, I also had the members list. And I looked up Bill Delp's name, who was a hitman there in Seattle, and killed somebody, and he was the one who showed up to Heckle Dennis's appearance in Colorado, and the first time he'd left Ventura City in a year, after being jailed. And so anyway, people like Bill Delp are fringe science organizations are crawling with people like him who represent the global elite, et cetera, to make sure that they keep their tabs on things. Nobody gets too far along, like bringing free energy to the world. That would upset the apple cart. So, and I'll deal with Brian a lot more in the future. Anyway, so that was really kind of my first year there in Ohio. Was just, it began my days of study, deep study, and I really built my library. Today, let's see, my hard copy, so my books, so hard copy books, I got a couple thousand, something like that. Then I got a Kindle 5 years ago, and on the Kindle, I probably have 1,000 books. And so yeah, but I really didn't start building my library in earnest until then. Yeah, my library was pretty thin before I moved to Ohio. And then I was studying with a vengeance again, subscribing to everything I could, a right wing, left wing, also mystical, science, media studies, alternative medicine, all this stuff, and it was a great time for me. It really was. Those were pretty happy years for me. I still have a drinking problem. In fact, that was really when I moved there. I started trying to see if I could stop drinking. I had a 10-year battle with the bottle, though. So, in fact, and my drinking was always directly correlated to how much stress I was under. So, but the first year was really a good one. And my wife and I were newlyweds. It was just the two of us for the next 6 years, and those were great years. Um, anyway, so that's all I have for this little session. Bye for now.